think. This is an artificial cockroach. Not only does it walk like the real thing, it even thinks like it. Studying the brains of insects is giving us unexpected insights into the nature of intelligence and how to build it. We're on the verge of making computers that can tell the difference between the faces of men and women, appreciate emotions, sadness, happiness,
smiling,
give us clues to the motivations of living things. Maybe even let us build machines that can impersonate them. Perhaps even build ourselves. This isn't a computer laboratory. It's a schoolroom. Dave Cressy is conducting the lesson. He's teaching a new sort of computer called a neural network how to tell when an underground platform is too full for comfort.
The first and most important thing I have to do with a neural network is to teach it what is meant by a full, half-full or empty platform. And the way I'm going to do this is to show the neural network examples of each type of platform. And what I'm doing now is to show the neural network examples of full platforms. So images come up on the screen, and the neural network actually looks at these images and learns what is meant by a full platform. I shall now go on to half full. And then finally to the empty class. What I'm going to do now is to test the neural network's performance on images that it never saw before. And this is the interesting part. So, let's see how it gets on a full image that it never saw before. It's quite obvious to the human observer that it is in fact a full platform. And now let's ask the neural network what its opinion is. And in this particular case, it's got it incorrect. You can see that the neural network is at the moment confused between the full and the half-full classes. Let's try another one. And in this particular case, the neural network gets it absolutely right, which, considering it's only actually ever seen 2 full platforms before, is pretty good. Let's have a look at how it's doing on the half-full classes. And the neural network is confused between half-full and full. So far, the neural network isn't doing badly, but it really doesn't yet have enough experience to make it correct enough of the time. And so what I'm going to do now is go back into the training phase and to give it some more examples to learn on. Now that the neural network has actually been taught 20 images from each class, I'm going to go back to the images that it got wrong before and see if it can get them right this time. Let's try on half full. And there we are. The neural network in this particular case is very confident that it is a half-full platform. Well done. What I'm going to do now is to feed the neural network with a whole load of images taken at random that it has never seen before. And so now, when faced with these random images, it appears the neural network's not making any errors at all.
The basic design of the computers we see all around us hasn't changed for 50 years. When we type something on a keyboard, we send information to the computer's processor. Each piece of data is fed to the computer in sequence. The computer deals with it, sends it on its way, and moves on to the next item. It processes that one, then the next one, and so on step by step through the stream of data being fed to it. It's a powerful way to manipulate data, but it does have its disadvantages.
A serial computer is a marvelous machine.
It functions by working with a program, that is a set of rules, as to how to operate on what is stored in it, that is its data. Now the data are numbers, and it operates by adding them, or multiplying them, or dividing them. It's very effective because it can do this many times a second, billions of times a second, for example, far faster than we could do this. And it can tackle very, very difficult problems thereby. But it has a difficulty. Suppose we take an infant in a crowded room. That infant, at the age of a few weeks, can recognize its mother's face very, very effectively. Computer here, in spite of its size, it couldn't do that. What's the problem? The problem, effectively, is that we're talking about an infant working without rules. It's solving problems without rules. The serial computer has to have the rules. It has to have the program.
When a serial computer is used to perform a so-called intelligent task, or a task which, if done by humans, would be said to require intelligence, this has to be worked out by a programmer, step by step. The tasks I'm talking about don't require you to be a genius. They're things like recognizing faces, recognizing language, following a conversation very, very rapidly. It's enormously hard to get conventional computers to do that, for the simple reason that a programmer can't easily work out how this is done. And when he does, there are usually loopholes in that which make the program rather incompetent.
Neural net researchers realized that these limitations could be overcome. To build something as powerful as the human brain, they argued, you had to copy the way the brain works.
The inspiration behind neural networks is the human brain. It looks like two fistfuls of porridge, but it's very complicated. It's made up of tens of billions of nerve cells, each of them very small, even less than a millimeter in size. It's because that they all function in parallel simultaneously that this is so effective. But even more than that, when the brain goes into a new environment, the way one nerve cell affects another can be modified. We're beginning to understand the way that these connection weights, that is, the ways one nerve cell affects another, are changed by different environments. And it's through that set of rules, of changes of connection weights, that we think we'll be able to understand the whole of this complexity, how it was even that Mozart and that Einstein were able to have their amazing creativity in this two fistfuls of porridge.
Researchers have found that the brain processes information through this vast network of interconnecting pathways, many billions of them. Signals travel down these pathways from nerve to nerve. The strength or weight of the impulses controls how the brain stores and manipulates data.
We can start to reproduce the activities of the brain artificially by modeling the single nerve cell. Now, the single nerve cell is a very small device. It acts by taking note of the total activity moving onto it, coming onto it, and responds if there is enough activity giving out a nerve impulse. If there's too little activity, it doesn't respond. So it's a little decision unit, a very simple device. That can be modeled in silicon.
The basic building block of a silicon brain is an artificial nerve cell. These cells perform a very simple function. They either pass on a signal or block it. On their own, these cells can't do much, but when they're arranged in a network, they start to show surprising abilities.
The study of the brain has been very important so far in developing neural networks, because if we didn't have the example of the brain, we wouldn't have believed that a bunch of relatively dumb little processors with variable connection strengths between them could actually learn complicated things. I mean, it stretches one's credulity to believe that a whole bunch of dumb processors with connection strengths between them could be turned loose on perceptual input coming from the world and could actually invent the correct model of how the world works. But that's what little kids do all the time. And so the brain tells us it can be done, and it tells us something about what the hardware looks like. And so we know that this is a soluble problem. And that means you're much more willing to put a lot of effort into solving it. If it wasn't for the existence of the brain, I wouldn't believe this kind of thing could be done at all.
Part of the power of the brain comes from its ability to process many pieces of information at the same time, what's called parallel processing. But simply connecting a lot of processors together isn't enough to make an intelligent machine. The connections have to be the right ones. To make the right connections, researchers give their machines a surprising ability. Neural networks are built in such a way that they can themselves alter the electronic connections between their artificial nerves. It's here that teaching comes in. The teacher gives the network examples, such as empty or full underground platforms. When the network gives the wrong answer, the teacher tells it to rearrange its internal connections, to try a different organization of nerve cells. When it gives the right answer, the teacher instructs it to keep the arrangement it already has. Eventually, a stable pattern of connections becomes established, and, just like a real brain, the pattern forms a representation, an image of the information fed to the network.
This is our version of Yorick. We've given him two eyes that are simple photoelectronic sensors. They send signals down to a neural net. This neural net doesn't have a computer in it. It's just made out of 256 silicon neurons. These silicon neurons are not only connected to the eyes, but also to one another. So they get into a state. We call it a mental state because it's a little bit like the states that our own brains get into when we look at things or hear things. Now, the important thing here is that we can actually look at his mental state by taking his plastic head off. So far, Yorick's only learned about two things, light and darkness, and has developed its neurons to create internal mental images of day and night. And we can test this by presenting it with images that are light and dark and look to see what's going on in his head. Now, there is a state we can create simply by cutting the sensors off, which is a bit like sleep in human beings. At that point, the neural network starts running off on its own and has flashes of the images that it's learned. Now, that may be what dreaming is all about.
The fact that the network can change its own internal organization as it learns has important consequences. It means that nets are not mere slaves to a fixed built-in program. As a result, they can solve problems which have so far defeated computer programmers. Among them, many tasks human beings perform effortlessly. We can tell the difference between men and women, for instance, pretty easily. It's extremely hard to write a computer program which can do the same thing. But a neural network called SexNet has learned to discriminate between the sexes. It's the brainchild of Terry Sinofsky.
SexNet is one of my most favorite networks. We're interested in vision. How is it that we can look at a person and recognize that person, and even more basically, recognize what their sex is? That's a problem of pattern recognition that is very difficult to program into a computer with a conventional approach. However, by taking examples of faces in the same way that we're able to take examples of words and feed them as input, we're able to teach the network how to make the discrimination between the features in the face that characterize males with those that characterize females. The network is given examples of faces. Now, the first time when it's given a face, it may incorrectly identify it as female, but a teacher provides the network with the right answer, and using that knowledge, the network is able to readjust the connections within the network so that the next time it sees the face, it will give the correct answer. Now, it may not do it correctly for new faces, but gradually with more and more examples, it's able to pick out what's common about all the male faces and be able to assign a new face to the correct category, male or female. Now, we took away all of the secondary sexual characteristics to make it a particularly difficult problem. No hair, only from the chin up. And testing members of my own lab, humans can do around 90%. The network has achieved the performance which is a little bit better than that, about 92%. And what this means is that either neural networks are better than humans, or members of my lab need more experience with discriminating sex.
When we walk home.
SexNet learned in the same way we do, by trial and error and by example. It takes several years for children to learn to read.
I like to go to my grandmother's because she gives us candy and we eat there.
Learning to connect the written word with the sound it makes and the meaning it contains is a laborious, repetitive process. But eventually, the rules of language become imprinted in the mind.
To my cousins. Some
Terry Sanofsky has taught a machine to read in exactly the same way.
cousins.
NetTalk is a neural network that's been taught to read English out loud. The network is given letters and words as they be written on a page as the input, and the output are English speech sounds or phonemes. And the task that the network has is to associate with each letter of each word the correct sound. Now that's a very difficult task for English because the spelling, as you well know, is very irregular and it's very difficult to learn, and it takes many years to be able to read and to spell properly. What you're going to hear is what the network sounds like at the very beginning of training when it's just learning the different sounds and how they might go together. The network is going to be learning as you listen to it. We call this the babbling phase, and it sounds like a little baby just beginning to make speech sounds. The network likes vowels, but it begins to intersperse the vowels with consonants, ba, ba, ga, ga. Now this is the second stage of training after a few hours in the computer. You'll hear discrete words, but they're not English.
Wake up. Many times. Sometimes. We sleep. Here. Night faded. Sometimes. Wait.
Now you're going to hear what it sounds like when you come back in the morning. It's been training overnight.
When we walk home from school, I walk home with 2 friends. And sometimes
Two friends.
We can't run home from school now. I like to go to my grandmother's because she gives us candy. We eat there sometimes.
Making a machine that can read is quite an achievement, but it's by no means the limit. In Toronto, a network is learning to interpret the flickering movements of the human hand.
We were interested in the ability of neural networks to learn by experience. So we took a very difficult task, which is getting a person to make movements of their hand to drive a speech synthesizer so that they can talk with their hand instead of with their normal vocal apparatus.
Glove talk is the mechanical equivalent of sign language, producing words from the patterns made by a hand. The glove talk glove feeds information to the neural network about the shape, position, and movement of the hand inside it.
The basic way you tell it that you want to say a word is you form the shape with your hand and then you move like that. The model's a bit like a conductor trying to make the drums go boom. You go like that, and when you hit the end, it's meant to go boom. Here, when you hit the end, it's meant to say the word. So there's a neural network that runs all the time that's trying to decide if you just made a movement like that. And that neural network was the trickiest one to get working, because when people hold their hand there, it sort of drifts around, and the net has to decide whether that was just sort of random drift, or whether the person really intended to say a word. And then once that system's recognized that you intended to say a word, another network reads the shape of the hand, that is, reads all these measurements coming from the glove, and decides which word it was. There's yet another net that decides which direction you went in, and that determines the ending on the word. So if you say the word short, you move one way and it says shortly, you move another way and it says shorted, and so on.
The network converts the hand movements into a synthetic voice. The result? A mechanical rendition of a simple sentence.
You are not my sister or their daughter.
The way we initially train glove talk is the computer flashes a word for the user to try and produce. The user then makes the hand shape they think is correct for that word, and that happens a few times for each word. The computer then simulates the neural network and changes the weights in the neural network in such a way that when the user makes one of those shapes, the computer will respond by telling the speech synthesizer to produce that word. So because the computer told the user what word to say, it knows what the right answer is. and it can get to see all the variations that that user makes in producing that word. Then, after the user's finished the training session, the computer will then train for several hours to adjust all the weights so it produces the right response. Once the network's trained on one user, it can adapt rapidly to new users. It simply gets the new user to try and produce the various words. And then instead of having to adjust all the weights from scratch, it takes the weights it used for the previous user and just changes them slightly so as to accommodate the slight differences between the new user and the previous user.
Neural networks are giving us machines that can learn to read, to recognize faces, to turn patterns into sounds. Why not ones that can find their own way around? This is Frank the robot. This is Martin Snaith, his trainer. Frank has a brain, not a very large one. It's got about 100 artificial nerve cells in it. Nevertheless, Frank can do something that most other robots can't. He can read a map his trainer's programmed into him.
Frank is a neural network system that's designed to run through mazes, either real-world mazes or laboratory mazes, and he is able to get from a destination point back to a start point, or from a start point to a destination point. And that's designed to allow you to do some kind of real-world task, like taking a piece of paper from one guy's desk to another, for example. Frank knows where he is in the maze because he recognizes the things that he sees as he sees them. He uses the context. So he's expecting to see certain features one after another in the maze, just like you would do when you were following a map. In fact, Frank has got a map. Now, I use that word very loosely. It may well be totally different to the type of map that you and I use, but it is a neural implementation of a map. And this particular neurocomputer here is expecting to see a certain set of features which describe the robot's goal. So the robot will carry on in the maze as long as what the robot sees in the maze lines up with what the robot expects to see. And when the robot sees the set of features that has been written out as the goal, then it plays a tune or whatever, rings a bell or gives the guy the piece of paper, whatever it's designed to do for the particular application. It can then swap the map or turn it upside down and follow the map back to where it came from.
A number of sensors on Frank's head feed him information about his surroundings. A central neural network processes this information and parcels it out to further networks. These do the donkey work of controlling Frank's movements.
On a system like Frank, you need, say, about 100 neurons to perform the kind of tasks that this robot can do. And to design a network with all of those 100 neurons all at the same time is really difficult. In fact, in many cases, it's impossible. So what we do is we cluster the neurons together into small groups of, say, 10 or 12 neurons that have a particular function. Take, for example, this set of neurons here. They're designed to recognize two different types of features, a T-junction and a right-hand corner. And once they've extracted that information from the data, they can then communicate simply with the other neural computers on the robot just by one or two activity signals, rather than a whole bunch of wires. Rather than us connecting all the neurons in this card to all the neurons on the other cards, we can just connect one or two wires from a cluster of neurons to another cluster of neurons. Now that is very similar to what happens inside an animal or an insect, whereby you'll get a very complicated cluster of neurons interconnected very heavily, and then that'll have a very simple connection to another complicated cluster of neurons. So it makes the design much more easy to manage and much more easy to do.
Frank scores over existing robots by being flexible. He can find his way around not just the maze he's been trained in, but in any maze which is roughly the same.
One of the advantages of neural network systems is that they are prototypically trained. You train them on an example of a particular situation. You don't need to train them on the exact situation. Systems like Frank are particularly flexible because they can ignore dynamic obstacles up to a certain point. So if you throw a brick at Frank, as long as the brick doesn't completely block Frank's field of view, then Frank can get through take evasive action, go around it, and that won't really disturb the mapping function.
Neural networks are acquiring a surprising number of human-like qualities. They can recognize patterns, deal with incomplete information, make decisions, learn from experience. These abilities are making them valuable to industry. Wizard was among the first to be recruited.
This is the Wizard neural network, which is used for the recognition of images. It was built about 10 years or so ago, so it's been around for a little while. It's actually been used in industry for recognizing piece parts going past production lines. What happens with it is that the camera takes images which are sent to the Wizard, which is a bunch of 250,000 neurons. The neurons are trained to recognize these images by outputting a signal, which either goes to a loudspeaker or some lights, or it can even drive a robot. What it's been trained on now is to recognize my face when it's smiling, frowning, and doing other things. Let's get it to do its thing.
Frowning, smiling, frowning, smiling. Where's he gone?
Of course, this thing can be used to do things other than just recognize my face. Intruder detection, someone coming into a field that's not expected. The system can be tuned to accept some people and not others. This can be done for access to a building, recognizes the faces of those who are allowed access and those who are not. Reading of any kind, reading of handwriting, block codes, things on the front of envelopes. Counting banknotes, making sure that someone hasn't slipped the wrong thing into a banknote. Signature verification on checks. A whole host of things that requires the recognition of complex visual signals.
Systems based on neural networks can take some of the drudgery out of repetitive or mundane tasks. In Japan, a network is employed to sort and grade apples. Others are coming which can recognize handwritten numbers on checks, for example, or can sort mail quickly and efficiently by recognizing postcodes. These applications, say the researchers, are just scratching the surface of the capabilities of neural networks. Truly intelligent machines will change our lives dramatically, in the office, the factory, and at home.
I think you've watched too many soap operas this week. I think it's time for something more interesting.
Nature has had several million years to perfect the brain. Neural network researchers have been trying to build artificial ones for all of 4 decades. Some researchers have realized that they would be unwise to ignore the computing solutions built into the wetware of the brain. They don't want merely to simulate the way the nervous system works. They want to build something which is, to all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from an organic brain. Their research is directed towards copying the brain's architecture and organization and reproducing it in silicon. They hope that by doing so, they'll be able to build in the flexibility and adaptability of behavior seen in even the simplest living animal. This is the stimulus for the artificial insect project at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Randy Beer is building a mechanical housewife's horror, a neural network which can reproduce some of the brain activity of the cockroach.
The Artificial Insect Project was motivated by a desire to bring artificial intelligence research into a little closer contact with biology. Historically, artificial intelligence systems have been largely motivated by trying to reproduce very high-level human cognitive skills like language or reasoning, theorem proving, things like that. And those systems tend to be very brittle and very narrow in their expertise. Our feeling was that if we look a little closer to the biology and look to much simpler animals than people that can get along very well in the real world, though they can't prove theorems or play chess, they are very good at dealing with whatever comes up in a real-world situation in the way that AI systems are not. And so what we tried to do was say, let's set out to build an artificial insect analogous to a real insect, and let's try to have it solve some of the same problems that a real insect can solve, and let's base the design of its nervous system on what's known about insect nervous systems.
The result was a computer bug which can do similar things to a real insect. This is computer food. Like real insects, the neural bug is always hungry. The first thing it does is locate lunch. But in the way is a wall. When the bug hits it, it's forced into a second sort of behavior. It follows the edge. By now it's walked so far that energy is getting low, and by the time it finds its way around the wall, the bug is too far from the food to detect it. So a third behavior, random wandering, takes over until it finds another edge. Or senses the food again. Then the desire to feed takes control once more. Artificial bug heaven. Food in sight and nothing in the way. Found. An electronic banquet for the hungriest of bugs. Beer has learned enough about how the cockroach walks to try to build one. The nervous circuit responsible for driving the insect's legs was built into this robot model.
One of the main advantages of basing a robot on the biology is that biological organisms are much more robust, much more flexible than anything that we've been able to engineer from scratch within our technology. And so what we're hoping to do is transfer some of that robustness and flexibility from the biological world into the robots that we'd like to design. Most conventional robots are designed only to work in very restricted domains. For example, a factory floor that's specifically designed to accommodate their needs. We're much more interested in building robots that can get around in existing environments that aren't pre-designed to accommodate them. For example, the kind of environments that people live in, for example, a home environment. And that requires a certain degree of flexibility and robustness, which most current robots simply do not have. Biological organisms have those characteristics, and that's why we'd like to see ideas from biology transferred into the control of robots.
Making a machine that can walk is one thing, but to build a totally independent robot, we'll need to give it senses: touch, smell, hearing, and vision. At the California Institute of Technology, Carver Mead is building an artificial retina, the part of the eye which turns the light we see into nerve impulses which our brains can interpret.
Here at my lab at Caltech, we build systems that are models of pieces of the nervous system, like the retina or the cochlea in your ear. What I mean by a model is a system that in some way does a similar function. And by building models this way, we use microchip technology, the technology that was designed originally for computer chips. But it lends itself well to building these systems which emulate in some way pieces of the nervous system. Because down at the bottom, the physics of the transistor is not really that different from the physics of the nerve membrane.
This is a chip which is seeing light and then doing computation on it. It's unlike a TV camera in that it's not trying to perfectly image as perfectly as possible what it's seeing. It's actually trying to do computation, like our brain does, from the retina. And the computation it's doing is looking for changes in the intensity. And the idea there is that what's important to the brain is what's changing in the world. If something is just sitting there, it's not important. It's not interesting. It's something that's not going to eat us, or it's not moving relative to us. So what the pixels on this chip here are doing is just simply looking for whether the intensity is getting brighter or darker. So if I try to hold perfectly still, all it sees are my blinks. And if I take these patterns here of black and white squares and hold it in front of the picture, the middle of the squares is the same color as the outside of the squares, even though the middle of the squares is really black and the outside is white. So when there's no change, it just settles down to the same 0 level all over. It's only when the squares move do the cells put out anything. And that's like the computation that the retina is doing on the image before it gets sent to the brain. And so that's the kind of pre-processing that we're doing here. We're trying to actually do computation on the image, not build TV cameras, but actually try to pre-process the image so that we can do something more interesting with it later, like motion, or whether we're coming towards something, or whether something is moving left or right. And these are the kind of things that we're going to have to be able to do if we want to build machines that can really navigate, drive a car, or fly a plane, or things like that.
Each of these different microcircuits performs a unique function. Exactly this kind of separation of functions goes on in real brains. The artificial retina is closely modeled on the real thing.
If you take a computer like a housefly, a single simple little housefly, we think it's doing more computation in the brain of that housefly than in 100 Cray supercomputers. And the reason for that is that it's specialized and it's optimized over billions of years of evolution to try to do those particular computations that it needs. It can't predict the weather or the stock market, but it can navigate around the world and do it very well. And the reason it can do that, of course, is that it's doing all that processing of all the information that's coming in, the incredible flow of information, with specialized circuits. These are the kind of circuits that we're trying to build here.
Following nature closely has clearly brought benefits for the Caltech group and a few problems, such as how to find a place in the circuitry of the artificial eye from which the wires can lead out. The solution was to gather them all in one spot, but that spot would be blind. The human eye has an exactly similar blind spot where the optic nerve carries out information to the brain. The payoff from copying biology has prompted some researchers to use not the ends, but the means of nature. They're trying to make smarter machines by putting them through a version of the process which produced human beings, evolution by natural selection. Martin Snaith has used what's called a genetic algorithm to build Igor. Igor has all the right equipment for walking, he just doesn't know how to use it.
A genetic algorithm is just how it sounds. It's a model of what happens in natural selection. Now, in natural selection, you take a population of animals, and the ones that are successful, the ones that have the correct solution to the problem of life, get the chance to breed, and that's a mutation of their genes, which then carry on to try and approach the ideal solution to the problem of life, say. Now, in a machine system, it's a bit cruder than that, obviously, because it's a model, but we can take what the quality factor is and determine it for ourselves. In natural selection, it's whether you breed, but in a walking robot, it would be how far you walked, for example. So we can decide which of the members of the population that had a quick stab at how to walk were any good. And then we can mutate from them to hopefully get closer to a better walking machine.
Igor's genetic algorithm selects variations in the connections of his neural net.
Igor's there to learn how to walk. We're really far more interested in the learning than we are in the walking at this stage. If I was going to design a walking machine just for walking, then I wouldn't design something like Igor. We'd sit and do a big engineering job that was all precise and didn't have lots of wires hanging around and stuff. But Igor is there really to study learning. We're interested in machines that can solve difficult problems. And learning to walk on a chassis like Igor is very difficult. And so it's a good trial for a learning system.
Like evolution, genetic algorithms work by trial and error. Igor tries to walk. He can measure how well he does by measuring how far he gets. Then he tries again, using a different set of connections in his neural networks.
Igor only uses the genetic part of its system when it's never seen a particular situation before. So if the robot finds itself in a circumstance that isn't near any of the circumstances that it has knowledge of, previous knowledge of, then it's got to do something. Now, it could either just take a wild guess, or it could take what it did last time and just try and mutate it a little bit. And now this is the genetic flavor that Igor has. Igor takes the current vector and twists it around a bit and tries it again and sees how well it does. And if it did no good, it throws it away and tries another one.
Genetic algorithms allow the designer to try out an enormous number of different networks, including many that arise randomly. A similar technique was used to hone the performance of London Underground's crowd sensing net.
In taking a neural net that knows nothing about platforms and passengers and making it learn to make those judgments, we've really taken one trick from nature, which is learning systems. And in this application, we can take another trick from nature, and we can actually take the neural net and evolve it so that it can make those decisions even better. And to do this, we use a genetic algorithm, which is a way of successively improving the architecture of our neural net so that it can make that decision better and better. And what we've done here is to allow the neural net to change where it focuses its attention in the visual field. We started off with a neural net that had its attention uniformly across the whole of the visual field, and then we allowed them to mutate and to vary a little, and we picked out the ones which performed best. And we found after several generations of that evolution that indeed we were getting better performance, and the way the neural net was getting better performance was by concentrating its attention on just those parts of the visual field where the passengers were, and ignoring the parts of the visual field, like the walls of the platform, where essentially there was constant information, so no useful information to help it make that decision. So what we've got here is something like an animal which lives in a special habitat where some parts of its visual field are no use to it. And over several generations, that animal has evolved to essentially have fewer neural connections to those parts of its visual field and to concentrate its attention on just those parts which are useful for making the decision it has to make.
Genetic algorithms can help find the best network for a particular job, but they can't solve another problem. Who's going to teach all these knowledge-hungry networks? The answer might be themselves.
In unsupervised learning, the idea is that the neural network gets to look at the input, it gets to look at input coming from some environment, but nobody tells it what it should be doing. Now, you might think that since there's no definition of what it ought to be learning, it couldn't possibly learn in those circumstances. But there are now a number of learning algorithms that allow a network, when it receives input from the environment, to create internal representations of the causes of that input. So let me give you one example of how unsupervised learning might be possible. If you see some rigid three-dimensional object, suppose my hand was rigid, and you get input, images of this object rotating in space, then the images are all rather different from one another, but there's something common about all the images, namely this three-dimensional shape. So a neural network that assumes that the things that it sees at neighboring times probably have some common underlying cause might actually be able to learn about three-dimensional shape by internally trying to figure out what's common to all these inputs.
Unsupervised learning was developed by Professor Teuvo Kohonen at the University of Helsinki. He used it to develop a phonetic typewriter which responds not to commands from a keyboard, but to the more variable and inconsistent tones of the human voice.
It was around 1975 when we really started doing work on speech recognition. But it was not until about 1981 when I invented some new principles, the self-organizing map. And using these maps, we were aiming at a phonetic typewriter which is able to write out from general dictation, not just bound to any vocabulary.
As the phonetic typewriter receives inputs from a voice, different parts of the neural network are stimulated. Each part of the network has a letter assigned to it. By learning to make the connection between sounds and letters, the network can print the right words on the screen. An internal dictionary enables it to correct the spelling as it goes along. Already, neural networks are close to taking over some of the activities we think of as human. Banks are currently testing their efficiency in predicting the movement of the stock exchange. They can do at least as well as human stockbrokers. And in upstate New York, A neural network has replaced a team of technicians trained to spot cancerous cells among hundreds of thousands of healthy smear samples. The machine can do the job in a fraction of the time and never gets tired or bored. Impressive though these abilities are, neural net researchers remain unsatisfied.
If you ask sort of how sophisticated are the neural networks or AI systems that we have at present as compared with animals, my view is that the neural networks we have at present are kind of comparable with a slug or something, maybe a fraction of a slug. We really are nowhere near having the sophistication of something like a cat or a dog or a rat. Those are much more sophisticated information processing systems. It may appear that some of these neural networks are cleverer than rats because, for example, they can read digits, which rats maybe have some difficulty doing. But rats do a whole lot of other things very well. So we're a very long way away from coming anywhere close to real biological intelligence. And I think it'll be quite a long time before we get anywhere near it.
If the promise of neural network research is so far unrealized, the aims are extremely ambitious. The researchers will settle for no less than a conscious machine.
A real intelligent system would have not only the vision and hearing front ends, but it would also have an interpretation system that could learn from the images and the sounds and extract information and correlate that with what it's heard and seen before. And that requires a mechanism of long-term learning. The neural network field is developing mechanisms like that, and we're building mechanisms like that onto silicon right now. It won't be too many years before we really have systems that have vision and hearing front ends that can actually learn from those scenes and from those sounds.
With Carver Mead's chips, we're able to take in sensory information, the current state of the world. With neural networks, we're able to interpret that information, to figure out what's out there. But the next step is to be able to use that information to plan the future, to be able to decide, make a decision, an intelligent decision about how to interact with the world, to try to anticipate problems that may come up and to try to solve them. And these are problems that are going to require much larger structures beyond the network. And here we may be able to get some clues from the brain.
What then is stopping us from building a machine which can match human intelligence?
I think at the present time, we have enough technology to build anything we could imagine. Our problem is we don't know what to imagine. We don't understand enough about how the nervous system computes to really make more complete thinking systems. We have little tiny insights that we've gotten from studying biological systems. And we can build little systems based on those, and we can make them work, and we can understand a little more, and then we can go and ask the biology some more questions, and we can learn a little more. But it's slow going. The brain is an enormously complicated thing. Even very small parts of it are way beyond anything we understand. So we're really limited by our understanding, not by our ability to build things.
People talk about building a conscious machine. To some extent, that will always be a fantasy, and some people will never accept that anything except a human being can be conscious. They won't even accept that animals are conscious because they can't use language. But that's an area of philosophy which I don't think I want to get into right now. With neural networks, we're beginning to see a definition of something which could be the beginnings of consciousness, and that is their ability to build up internal experience to which they can relate. It's this relating to previously learned things, being able to take actions on these things, the fact that there is something going on inside the network which makes use of information coming in. This thing that's going on inside could be referred to as the beginnings of thinking or consciousness inside a highly artificial system. So I would call it artificial consciousness so as not to confuse it with the human kind.
Networks are a state of mind. And I think that someday in the future, your best friend may be a neural network.
If so, then neural networks really will change the way we live. But more modest consequences are equally likely. On the cards are intelligent kitchen scales that can work out if you're eating too much fat. Coffee machines that make it just as you like it. Toast, done to a turn. Perfectly. Every time. High-tech industries around the world are looking to neural networks to power a consumer revolution. They see a new generation of intelligent domestic appliances. An artificial butler may still be some way off, but self-steering vacuum cleaners that learn their way around the house might be just around the corner.
Well, next Sunday at 7 o'clock, Equinox looks at the engineer extraordinary Ben Bowlby, whose dyslexia is not proving a handicap. In fact, he's proving to be something of a surprise packet in the competitive world of motor racing. And don't forget that most of the programs in the Equinox series are available on video. If you'd like more information, please call Equinox Video on 0532 438 283, extension 4060 or 4075, on Mondays to Fridays between 9 a.m. and 5:30 p.m.